Hello, and welcome to Why Wars Happened, a weekly history podcast where we talk about what led to war in history. I'm your host, Emily Ross, and today we're going to be discussing the things that led to the American Revolution with a focus on Virginia this season. Okay, so where we left off in the last episode was that the guy who was acting as governor in Virginia had died. The king had chosen a man in England to be governor of Virginia if anything should ever happen to Governor Berkeley. The people of Virginia had already known him from a couple of decades before when the king had given all of Virginia to a group of nobles, and Virginia had to get permission from the king to buy it back from the nobles. This man, the pampered lord, was one of those nobles. His name was Lord Culpeper. Governor Berkeley had died 2 years ago, and this guy was still overseas, unable to pry himself away from the pampered life of English court. So, while the colonists waited for this lord to come be their governor, one of Berkeley's closest allies was running things in his place. However, things were not well in Virginia. The assembly was fining and taxing the people in order to compensate themselves for losses during Bacon's rebellion. The king had told them to stop doing this, but they had ignored his order. When the king learned that the assembly was ignoring his order, he was furious. His advisors in England told him that the Virginia Assembly's refusal to follow his orders was a rebellion in itself. Remember that this king, King Charles II, had lived through the English Civil War, which was kind of a rebellion in and of itself, where Parliament executed the king, who was his father. Then this king, after his father had been executed, fled England to save his own life. He hid inside a tree, in secret rooms under houses, and disguised himself as a peasant as he fled to France. He also spent time in battle fighting Parliament's army. This king was no lover of rebellions. Any sort of rebellion would have brought back the feelings from the time that England's Parliament rebelled in the Civil Wars. So the king ordered the pampered Lord Culpeper to leave England and go to Virginia at once. Culpeper finally arrived in Virginia in 1680, and the temporary governor Chicheley stepped down. Culpeper told the assembly that the king was very unhappy with them ignoring his order, and the assembly told him that they didn't really care because they had good reasons to ignore it. Culpeper, being weak and inexperienced as a leader, didn't put up much of a fight and allowed the assembly to continue taxing and fining the people for the cost of the rebellion, even though the king had ordered them to stop. When the king had come out of hiding and had been placed back on the throne, he was very relaxed about how he ruled things. As he got more comfortable and the reality of running the colonies came into play, he began to take a more controlling stance. His father had been executed by a rebellious government. His own life had been in jeopardy from the rebellious Parliament soldiers. A colony's government ignoring the king could not be tolerated. Charles II began to clamp down on Virginia. In the previous episode, we discussed how he took back the power to appoint a governor for Virginia. Virginia had won the right to choose its own governor just years before this. No longer could they do so. He also told the assembly that they could no longer hear court appeals. Up until this time, when someone appealed a court decision, the assembly, half of which were elected by the people, heard the appeal. Now the king said, no more of that. He wanted control of that as well. Now they were ignoring his order to pardon Bacon's rebels and stop taxing them to make up for people's losses. Something had to be done. One of the next things King Charles did was to take away the governor's right to call the assembly together. This is important because the assembly got together each year and made laws. They talked about issues facing the people and usually came up with solutions to the problems in Virginia. But in order to get together, they had to be called together. They didn't just show up at the same time each year. They had to actually be called by the governor at that time each year. England was very far away. It could take months to get a message back and forth. Sometimes there were emergencies, and even without emergencies, regular business still needed to be conducted. Now, the governor was no longer allowed to call the assembly together. The king had said that only he, the king, could call the assembly together. If the king didn't forget about them due to being busy running other places, he might call them each year and he might not. He might tell the assembly that they had no right to gather in a certain year. It meant that Virginia was once again completely dependent on the king for it to even function. On top of that, the king made it clear that if he were to allow the assembly to gather, they must obey him, or he would tell them to pack it up and go home. Then the king went a step further and said that if he did call the assembly to gather, and they went about their business in passing laws, they had to submit all of those laws to him for approval. This was extreme. Before this, the king didn't ask to see laws in Virginia before they were passed. They were just voted on by the assembly, and then the governor signed them into law, just like today. But now he was really exerting control over them. And remember, it could take months just to receive a response from the king all the way over in England. It was so ridiculous for the assembly to wait for the king to call them together that Governor Culpeper disregarded this order. The colony simply couldn't run without being able to assemble every year at a moment's notice when emergencies happened. Remember the part about the king canceling the assembly's ability to hear court appeals? Well, luckily for Virginia, Governor Culpeper never got around to making the assembly do that. So this whole time, the assembly kept their right to hear appeals, even though the king wanted that right taken away from them. Governor Culpeper, used to his luxury ways of life, had been far too busy collecting money in these little con man schemes he had going on. We'll get to that in a moment. For the time being, Governor Culpeper was ordered to find a way for Virginia to make more money for the king. It had been long established in the colonies and in England that people could not be taxed without their consent, meaning the people had to be able to vote on the representatives that would in turn vote on taxes, like the way we do today. So Culpeper got more money for the king by having the assembly pass a new tax. This all seems very nice and well, and it wasn't a new tax exactly. It was a tax on tobacco leaving Virginia, and it was the same tax that already existed. However, the tax usually went to the Virginia government to pay for public things like police, roads, buildings, and other public services. Now, the tax money didn't go to the Virginia government. It went directly to the king. The idea was that he would give some of it to England and all of his other colonies too. The colonists were already on edge about taxes and had played a significant part in the feelings that led to Bacon's Rebellion. It was taking money from Virginia to spread around the empire while the Virginians had been used to it going back into their own colony. Governor Culpeper was also supposed to do a bunch of other things, like encouraging the production of things other than tobacco, everything possible to convert servants and slaves to Christianity, and forbidding severe treatment of servants and slaves, so long as they were Christian. This is around the time that slavery began to explode in Virginia. It was really around 1680 that it became a major business there. We might cover some of this in a later season, but as with many other things, we won't get too deep into stuff that didn't lead to the Revolution. Okay, back to Culpeper's money schemes. Get this, British soldiers had been sent over from England to restore order in Virginia, and when Governor Culpeper arrived, around 4 years after Bacon's Rebellion, there were still 2 groups of British soldiers in the colony. The soldiers had remained dutiful to their purpose, but by the time Culpeper arrived, they had not received any pay for several months, and feelings of mutiny began to spread among them. Before he left England, Governor Culpeper had been given money to pay the soldiers, and he had been given money to pay the families that had been feeding and housing the soldiers. This is where it gets a little weird. English coins at that time were extremely rare in the colonies. But there were Spanish coins that were a little bit more common. Each Spanish coin was worth about 5 small English coins. The name of the currency and the exact weight and all of that stuff is really unimportant. What's important to remember is that each Spanish coin was worth 5 small English coins. So, Culpeper arrives with his money and starts declaring that each Spanish coin is worth 6 small English coins, not 5. There was no reason for him to do this other than to pay people less money. So if he owed a soldier 30 English coins, he was supposed to pay them 6 Spanish coins. But since he randomly declared that each Spanish coin was worth 6 English coins, a soldier who was owed 30 English coins would now only get 5 Spanish coins. I know, it's a little complicated, but basically he said that Spanish coins were worth more than they actually were. So he was sent over with enough money to give each soldier 6 Spanish coins, but he only gave them 5 Spanish coins each. and Governor Culpeper kept each extra Spanish coin for himself. This is how he paid all the soldiers that remained in Virginia and how he paid the families who had been housing them. It's estimated that he gave himself around 1,000 pounds this way, which is 185,000 in today's pounds and 234,000 in today's dollars. On top of that, he managed to receive twice the salary that Governor Berkeley had received. Plus, he was also able to get England to send him money for his housing, his position as leader of the military, and remember, he was one of the two men whom the king had given all of Virginia to, and the Virginians were still paying him for some of that land back. His position as governor was a great way for him to make easy money, and he didn't seem to do much or care much for the well-being of the colony. As mentioned earlier, he was neglecting to deliver certain orders to the assembly. He was agreeing to the assembly's decision to disobey the king. He was cheating the soldiers and colonists out of money. This did earn him the assembly's approval. They had been deeply insulted by the king not allowing them to place the rebels who had taken everything from them on trial. The king had pardoned everyone who had taken part in the rebellion. They were no longer allowed to punish those who had ransacked their houses and wronged them. On top of that, the king wasn't allowing them to charge taxes in order to make up for their losses. Governor Culpeper wasn't really stopping them. In addition to this, remember in previous episodes, the king had sent a group of men to the colony to investigate things? Well, two men in the assembly had refused to cooperate with the king's men and therefore had refused to cooperate with the king. Because of this, the king had declared that these two guys were never allowed to have a seat in the assembly again. The problem with this is that the assembly members loved these men. They had considered them heroes for standing up against the king's intrusions on the assembly's rights. The assembly definitely wanted them back. So Governor Culpeper actually agreed to let those two men come back to the assembly, against the wishes of the king. Culpeper didn't seem to have any strong beliefs about government and order at all. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses between Culpeper and the assembly. Remember the tobacco tax that normally went to the Virginia government, but the king wanted to take it and spread it around the empire? Well, this was such a major issue that the assembly refused to even debate it. They said that the colony should have control over where the colony's taxes were to be spent. But Governor Culpeper was afraid of the king becoming angry and taking away the sweet job as governor from him. Culpeper was earning quite a lot of money from it. He was less afraid of the assembly members than he was of the king, and resorted to intimidation and bribery to get them to agree to spread Virginia's tax money around the empire. He threatened to collect all of the money from the colonists who owed years of back payments on the land they were renting from the crown. This would have caused an enormous resistance and possibly new calls for rebellion. So the assembly members agreed to allow the king to take their tax money and spread it around the empire. Eventually, Culpeper felt that he had done his job in the colony well enough, and he could return to the luxury life he yearned for back in England. The king had given him orders to not return unless the king himself gave him permission to return. But for the Lord Culpeper, Virginia was just too backcountry for him, and he needed to be home where he belonged. So, just as soon as the assembly was done with that year's business, he went off to England without the king's permission. He hadn't even been in Virginia for a full year. While he was in England, Culpeper remained the official governor of Virginia, and the guy who temporarily ran things before he arrived, Henry Chichley, once again ran the actual day-to-day things as though he were Virginia's governor. Back in England, Culpeper delivered a report to the king that all was well in Virginia, but this was not true. Other than the fact that the assembly was still pretty angry over not being allowed to regain the losses they had suffered from the rebellion, and the people being pretty angry at some of the taxes that were a bit heavy, other things were causing disruption to the happy lives of the colonists. The poverty that we discussed in previous episodes was still raging through the land. That's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. Join us next week when we discuss the Assembly's efforts to fix the poverty and the tobacco riots that followed. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and comment your thoughts on this episode below. See you next time on Why Wars Happened.